It happened that the Armenian queen Morphia and her husband, the Crusader King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, had 4 daughters. The oldest of the girls was Melisande, and you can see her here on the left side of the chart. Born in 1105, which you may or may not remember, we mentioned it last time, is the year that the great Catholicos Krikor Pahalavuni Vagayaser, the one who oversaw the transition from Armenia to Cilicia, the one who experimented with the possibility of multiple Catholicoses to govern and to care for the spiritual needs of Armenians who were now in a much wider diaspora. It's the year of his death. 1105 is the year that Melisande is born. And we'll return to the day of his death shortly. So as you can see, Melisande is born in 1105. She will begin to reign in Jerusalem in 1131. Meanwhile, Krikor III Pahlavuni, the Catholicos with whom we are going to be dealing tonight, was born before her in 1093, so he's a decade older than she is. And he begins to reign much earlier, in 1113. Their reigns will almost coincide, however, at the end. She is queen until 1161. He remains Catholicos until 1166. And if you're doing the math on these dates, you can see their relative ages as they begin their period of greatest activity. The third character that we're going to talk about this evening, who will be the subject of some of next week and certainly all of the last week in this short series, is Nerses IV Pahlavuni, born in 1102, so just a couple of years older than Melisande. He reigns as Catholicos from 1166 to 1173, a relatively short time, a difficult time. And as we'll see, there is much more to his story than those short regnal years would indicate. So, at the time of Melisande's birth, miles away from the holy city, young Krikor in his early teens was about to have his life turned upside down. Here's how it happened. Young Krikor, which may or may not have been his name at the time, we don't know whether he changed his name upon entering priesthood, was one of probably 6 siblings. Their father was a nobleman and a military figure named Abirat, highly respected man. He was the grandson of Krikor Magistros, whom we have mentioned earlier, and he was a nephew of Catholicos Krikor Vagayaser. In other words, young Krikor's family is very well connected. And 4 of the 6 children in the family would marry into Cilician noble houses. So their status in society is high. And the family's home was a fortified castle, a military position, where their father was responsible for overseeing the safety of his region. It was not very far from Harpert, and it was located in a region that would soon become a Muslim emirate. So at this particular time in history, the area is very insecure. There's work for Abirat to do. The area is also very strikingly beautiful. The fortress of Harpert overlooks the region. To the one side, stark landscapes, almost lunar landscapes of Anatolia. On the other side, as you can just barely see in the near distance, are beautiful bodies of water, lakes, which give the region its Armenian name, Tzovk. And the family fortress where Krikor was born stood on an island in a lake with one face toward the water and the other face toward the mountains beyond. There was a causeway from the mainland to their island home. And to the west of the house, to the west of the castle, lay what was called the Vosketasht of Kharpert, known today as Yelazik. And the exact location of the family's fortress was for a long time the subject of much debate because there were no remains of a fortress anywhere to be found. And so people speculated that perhaps the name Zovk was applied to someplace else where there were also lakes, and there were some searching about to find likely other locations for the castle that was putatively the family home of this branch of the Pahlavuni clan. There were even people who said the story was made up, that there really wasn't any castle. It must have been something other than that. But people living in the area around modern day Yelazik had a legend about a sunken city in Lake Khazar, a kind of an Atlantis tale. Scientists were very dubious about this possibility, but then, thanks to seismic or tectonic activity in the lake bed, something that happens also in Lake Van, so that the city of Akhlat is sometimes there and sometimes not. Sometimes you can see it and sometimes it's completely submerged. Anyway, due to movement in the lake bed, which changed the water level, architectural remains, you're looking at them here, surfaced above the water almost by magic, receiving the name Kilise Adası, Church Island. In 2005, there was an expedition to the site by Turkish marine archaeologists, and it revealed that indeed the native population's sunken city story was true. And I can remember when this was a new story. I was flying to Istanbul, and in the Plain Seat Pocket magazine, there were all these quite wonderful pictures. And there was actually a statement in the archaeological report, I don't know if it's still there or not, or whether that has been edited out, that speculated that this was indeed the fortress that was referred to as the home of this Pahlavuni clan branch. And below the water, and the remains rise and sink depending on the level of water in the lake, depending on that activity at the bottom of the lake. You can see that there are little bits of the tops of walls that are visible kind of in the distance. Then in the front, you have the forefront of the screen, you have more obvious remains of a building. And you really want to just kind of drain it, see what else is under there. Sometimes there's quite a lot above the water. And you can picture to yourself the battlements that were along the top of this wall that you can see. Battlements that will be quite important actually to our story. And below the surface of the lake, when archaeologists went down, they discovered more arches, additional buildings surrounding that main castle. In effect, they found a well-inhabited island that once sat much higher and that was indeed connected to the mainland by a causeway a kind of a land bridge. And it seems that the whole island at some point sank below the surface as a result of that same submarine tectonic activity that recently lowered the water level and lifted the fortress partially back out. So the expedition of archaeologists tentatively identified this sunken fortress in Lake Hazar as the fortress of Zovk, dating most of its structures to the days of Krikor's great-grandfather, in other words, Krikor Magistros. While they identified other parts of structures on the island as being much older and probably dating back as far as the 6th century. So the dating of the remains fits very well with two things. In his Ashcharatzuit in the 7th century, Movses Chorenatzi, to whom the work is attributed, describes the fortress as existing in the 7th century. And in his letters, Krikor Magistros identifies it quite clearly as being a property of his family. And certain elements of Krikor's childhood island home will become repeated themes in other places that he later chooses to live. So it's an interesting combination because yes, there are purely practical reasons why in an unsafe or insecure area, one might want to locate oneself in a safe place like a fortress near a body of water. But I do think there is more to it than that. I don't think it was all practical for Krikor. I think the feeling of home for him was the feeling of being on an island or a peninsula. That sense of security that you get from being separated from, a little bit above, outside the turbulence of the world. Surrounded by water that on the one hand protects and on the other hand gives life and refreshes. Anyway, we come to the year 1109, the year when everything changes in Krikor's young life. In 1109, he was away from home. He was around 16, and he was being educated at the best school of his time, the Red Monastery in Kesun, under the watchful eye of its dean, who was the great teacher Stepanos Manuk, a man who, as far as we know, didn't write much, but poured everything that he had and knew into his students. And he was also under the watchful eye of his cousin, the Katolikos Parser. It was a good situation. All the more so because the local prince, Kol Vasil, we speculated at one point whether his name was ironic. Maybe he was called Kol Vasil because he was so generous, or whether he actually did make some of his money by highway robbery. In any case, he was a relative of Krikor's mother. So it was a great location for him. The Katolikos is a relative, the prince of the area is a relative. It was as secure a location and as secure a future, actually, as one could want for their child. And I'm sure his parents felt that he was well situated. Life is good for young Krikor. He was a deacon and he was a rising star in his cousin's entourage. He clearly had a taste for and a talent for administration. And it seemed clear that he was destined for a good future in the church, whatever that might be. Now he knew, and a few others also knew, what that future would probably be. In 1105, when Katolikos Krikor Vagayaser was on his deathbed, he appointed Parser of Ani, whom he himself had made a bishop and who was related to him, to be his successor. But he didn't stop there. He didn't stop with just securing the next generation of church leadership. Because so many bishops and other people of importance were gathered at the Catholicos' bedside, he took the opportunity to make Parcer and others present swear that next after Parcer would be young Krikor. And at that time, he really was young. He was just 12 years old. The dying Catholicos had a special bond with the young man, and he saw in him the makings of a great leader. Plus, he had every reason to expect that Bishop Parcer would have a long reign as Catholicos. He was a very vigorous man, very fit, and that there would be plenty of time for him as a seasoned churchman to prepare Krikor to be a wise future Catholicos. And Krikor himself, who was probably actually present at that moment when the dying Catholicos Vagayaser made his wishes known. Krikor took his future possible responsibilities very seriously. And for the years after that roomful of senior churchmen had accepted Vagayaser's solemn oath to protect and support him, he served diligently as the right-hand man of Catholicos Parcer, devoting himself maybe even more than he did to his academic studies, to his practical training at the side of the Catholicos. So from 1105 to 1109, things had been very full and very good and very exciting, and there was so much to learn. And then came 1109. News reached Krikor that the family castle had been attacked by a Turkish force. And they gave him the good news first. His father, Abirat, had bravely repulsed them, defeated them soundly. They were fleeing, and the battle was all but ended. When the victorious Prince Abirat looked over the battlement of the castle roof, you remember we saw the top of those walls above the water. He looked over the battlement to take stock of the situation, maybe to begin kind of a general count of the dead and decide how best to deal with them. And at that moment, a wounded Turkish soldier lying on the ground below saw his moment to do something great. And with his bow, he shot an arrow at Abirat, and the arrow found its mark. The wounded Abirat caught hold of a piece of the parapet to keep himself from falling. The parapet broke, and he tumbled from the castle roof end over end onto the ground below. It was unclear whether it was the arrow that killed him or the impact. But in any case, he was counted among those martyred for the faith. And so Krikor received the news that not only had his father been killed, but that his mother and the other children were also experiencing an additional tragedy. After all, Zovk was a military stronghold. And so as soon as possible, and there's clearly unrest in the region, as soon as possible, the position is going to be taken over by a new commander. And so the new widow and her fatherless children had to leave their home behind and find shelter wherever they could with relatives. Krikor's mother eventually made her way to Kasun, where Kol Vazil and his wife took the family in. Arrangements were made for the older children. The youngest two would remain with their mother until they were old enough to be married into good families, to have careers open to them. It was the middle child who was the problem. Not quite old enough to be out on his own, not quite young enough to stay with his mother. And so at 8 or 9 years old, he was sent to school at Garmirvank. So just before Krikor turned 17, he found himself called upon to raise his little brother Nerses. And from all reports, he did it very well and conscientiously and with much love for his younger, much lighter personality, little harder to control sibling. And these were very difficult days. And they became even more difficult when Kol Vasil, who had been the protector of Krikor's mother and youngest siblings, died in 1112. His son, Vasil Jr., was not at all like his father. He was weak, he was indecisive, he would much rather party than protect his territory. He was not a fit successor to his father. And so Kol Vasil's death was not just a blow to Krikor's family, but it also destabilized the region, as other authorities and powers in the area realized that the great prince's son would be no match for them. And this destabilization would lead later to the relocation of the Katoliko state away from Garmirvank, but that's in the future. So in 1109, his father dies. In 1110, he becomes the caretaker of his brother. In 1112, the family protector dies. And then barely a year after Kol Vasil's death, in 1113, Katolikos Parsech took Gregory with him to visit a construction site for a building that he was working on in the Katolikos state compound at Garmirvank. And the Katolikos was excited about this project. He could see that the work is progressing nicely. And so he goes all through the building, asking for reports, details, seeing what there is to see. And then when they were touring the upper floor of the building, which was still open, a construction crane that was carrying a big beam accidentally struck the robust and agile Katolikos in the chest, sweeping him off the top of the building onto the ground on his back. It was totally unexpected. And the Katolikos' injuries were horrible. His body was broken beyond repair. And he realized that because of this unforeseen accident, he had not made the preparations that he would have liked to have made. And he realized that the future of the church, the future of the succession that had meant so much to Katolikos Krikor Vagayaser, would be in jeopardy. It would be up for grabs because of his sudden death. He knew that no matter how much the senior bishops respected the will of Katolikos Krikor Vagayaser, many of them would object to ratifying the Catholicosate of a 20-year-old Krikor. And so Parsa gathered the last of his strength and arranged to very hastily ordain Krikor as a bishop just before he died, in order to give him that one little bit of extra security. No one would be able to object. Not only is he too young, but he's just barely a priest. And Krikor too must have realized that this was not going to be easy. Having lost his father, his protector, and his mentor within a mere 4 years. Krikor was now on his own in the midst of a synod of much older, more experienced, ambitious bishops. And it was in this very difficult, fraught moment of his life when he realized that he was going to have to see the succession through on his own merit and by his own powers of persuasion, that Krikor learned that his lighthearted, not so serious little brother could actually be a pillar of strength when he chose to. In other words, when he wasn't being a pain, as younger brothers often are. And the two of them matured practically overnight as they faced the realization of how critical this moment was, not just for their own future, but for the vision of Krikor Vagayaser, for a Cilician-based Katoligose that would provide the point of stability for the faith and the church, even if that point of stability was not in the traditional Armenian homeland. Now, neither of these young men facing this situation full of unknowns and uncertainties had any inkling how long their collaboration was going to be. Nerses would be Krikor's right-hand man, his closest collaborator, his most trusted advisor, the engineer of many of the good things that Krikor did for the next 50 years. And that 50 years would bring a time indeed of unparalleled stability and productivity to the divided church. It wouldn't be easy. There would still be objections. There would be people whose agenda was not the same as theirs. There would be people whose vision differed almost diametrically from their own. But yet it would work because the two of them joined hands and stood together with the same vision at heart. Together, they would ensure the continuation of an Armenian Christian presence in the Middle East and to some degree in the homeland also. And next week, we'll talk about their accomplishments, their further heartaches. There are many opportunities, fruitful and unfruitful, successful and unsuccessful. Their disappointments, their family issues, and all of the other things that make life interesting, even for Catholicos. So we're going to leave them for just a second. And we're going to go back to Jerusalem, where this half-Armenian princess, Melisande, is turning 9 or 10. And like her older contemporary Krikor, she too was growing up into a sense of responsibility. She was responsible, she realized, as the oldest child, for her younger sister's welfare on the one hand, and she would take that responsibility very seriously. We probably will not be able to talk about that tonight because it is a soap opera in its own right, but perhaps next week. So on the one hand, she has responsibilities for her younger siblings in the same way that Krikor had a responsibility for Nersas. And on the other hand, she had responsibility for her father's kingdom. And as she grew older, she began to see how perhaps the welfare of her sisters could also be helpful in the welfare of the kingdom. It's very interesting to see that Melisande, without argument, would be her father's heir. He did not discriminate against her because she was a woman. No, he assured her that her eventual husband, whoever this person would be, would come to Jerusalem, if he wasn't already in the region, as her consort, not as king in his own right. And so Baldwin groomed his emotional, headstrong, brave, creative, and very politically savvy daughter for future power. And apparently, he did so very successfully. Even the crotchety old Archbishop William of Tyre, who was no fan of women, had nothing but praise for Melisande's political and military prowess. He said of her, she was a very wise woman, fully experienced in almost all affairs of state business, who completely triumphed over the handicap of her sex. I guess he couldn't resist throwing that in there. So she could take charge of important affairs, and striving to emulate the glory of the best princes, Melisande ruled the kingdom with such ability that she was rightly considered to have equaled her predecessors in that regard. So Baldwin did well by his oldest child. When her mother Morphia died, Melisande was 25 years old and still unmarried. That's an advanced age for an unmarried woman in this time. She was unmarried probably because her father wanted to be very, very careful about the credentials of his future son-in-law, the man who would share power in the largest Crusader kingdom, the largest Christian kingdom in the East. So by this time, Melisande's younger sisters, Alice and Odierna, had been married to men who would cement their father's local alliances. We'll talk about that more later. But Melisande was too valuable for that kind of local alliance, because whoever married her would take on joint responsibility for the whole of the Western Christian presence in the Middle East. Jerusalem was the kingpin in the European Christian presence in the Middle East. Melisande's husband, her father foresaw, would need to have a vast fortune of his own. He would need to have broad administrative experience, and he would need to have excellent military skills. Baldwin had no illusions. He knew that such a man would come with a price tag. There would be strings attached. He would not simply be coming to Jerusalem because Melisande was beautiful. He would not be coming simply for love. Hopefully he would also be coming for love, but certainly that would not be his only motivation. And so, having consulted with his daughter about this probability that whoever she marries would not be marrying her solely for herself, Baldwin entered into discussions with various important people in Europe consulting with them as to whom he should consider, whom he should approach as possible suitors for his daughter. And on the recommendation of the King of France, he finally entered into serious negotiations with the wealthiest and the most prestigious French military nobleman of the day, Fulk d'Anjou, a man who was said to be at least as powerful as the King of France himself. This is the castle at Anjou. Beautiful, wealthy, sophisticated, civilized, somewhat ruthless, certainly calculating. Fulk was a widower with grown children. He had just married his son, Geoffrey, whom you see on the left, to Empress Matilda on the right, who was the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. She was also Queen of England at the time of her marriage to Geoffrey. She retained her title as Empress even during her queenship. And for the record, she was 25 at the time of their marriage, and he was 14. For Fulk to pull off this alliance was a real coup. And because he succeeded, he set himself up to become the grandfather to the next King of England. He was, in other words, a major player. And he knew his own value. So the negotiations were not easy. He was not dying to come to Jerusalem and become a prince consort. So the price that he demanded for consenting to marry Melisande was very high. He said that he would indeed come on the condition that he be given the kingship outright, not through her. In other words, he was demanding that Baldwin would legally disenfranchise his daughter after having trained her as the future queen. In consultation with Melisande, Baldwin took a calculated risk and agreed to Fulk's conditions. What Melisande thought of her husband in these early days is not known. He was short, he was red-haired, he was bow-legged from living on horseback, he was hardly a young girl's dream. And he was 15 years her senior. Nonetheless, they were duly engaged. You can see him here on the left with her standing beside him. Her father is in the center wearing the crown, and there's a group of witnesses. And in good time, they were married, and their first child arrived in 1130, a son. And they named him Baldwin for his grandfather, who I'm sure was very gratified by this, and it encouraged him to take the step that he and Melisande had planned in advance of this marriage. Knowing that his death was near, Baldwin, you can see him lying on his deathbed in the top of the illumination. He held a coronation ceremony where he named all three, Melisande, Fulk and little Baldwin as his joint successors. Now you can see that the person who painted this illumination didn't favor that solution. The only person being crowned in this illumination is Fulk. That was not the case. Here's another slightly more accurate depiction where the two of them are being crowned together, although the young child is not shown. In other words, Fulk was not king outright. Melisand's power was equal to his own. This was not what he had intended. And he had, in a way, even less power than she did. Because the wily Baldwin, her father, also named her and only her as regent for their son. In other words, when the young Baldwin becomes king, if Fulk is still alive, the son is under the control not of Fulk, his father, but of Melisande, his mother. So after Baldwin's death, it's interesting to see the Jerusalem nobility fully supported Melisande. You would have expected them to support instead Fulk with his power and his military prowess and so on and so forth, but they really were not keen on his aggressive ways. They didn't like his kind of better than all of you attitude. And so he bided his time, grudgingly sharing the throne with her, although he worked to undermine her power wherever possible. Having been a famous builder in his own home country, Fulk launched a program to win the favor of the nobility by building strategically located fortresses to secure their kingdom. Here's another picture of their joint coronation. He not looking perhaps as pleased as he could have. This is one of the structures that he built in France. This is all that's left, unfortunately, of a major fort that he built at Ervine near Jaffa on the seacoast, what's now the seacoast of Israel. And the family of Ervine we will be coming back to shortly. He also built farther north on the coast a fortress at a place called Beit Gavrin. Now in ruins, but the ruins are impressive. He clearly was a builder. And he built, again, slightly further up the coast, a fortification called Blanche Garde. The three of them securing Jerusalem's vulnerable route to the sea. And little by little, patiently and with calculation, Fulk was eroding his wife's power. And it was only a matter of time until he did, in fact, become ruler of Jerusalem in his own right. And Melisande must have been wondering how to manage this situation. She knew what her father's intentions had been. She knew that she had the inner strength, but she lacked the opportunity. She didn't understand how to get the better of her husband, to get back the power that her father had intended for her to wield. And then, it's as good as in a movie, Fulk went just a step too far. in undermining his wife's rights. It's almost an unbelievable story. One of the nobles who most resisted Fulk's heavy-handed takeover of power from Melisande was her cousin and childhood playmate, a young man named Hugh of Eblin, the place whose tower we just saw. He is described as the most handsome and charming man in the entire Middle East, and as the count of the region around Jaffa, he was a man of status as well as a man of charm, a man of military prowess, as well as a pleasing companion. And it may be that Fulk saw a way in Hugh to kill two birds with one stone, to eliminate the leader of the opposition to him, and to take a swipe at Melisande's power and also at her family base at the same time. And so he publicly accused his wife, Fulk accused Melisande, of having an affair with Hugh. This would give him legal reason to get rid of her, legal reason to break the marriage and take power. Was there truth to the accusation? Well, there may have been an attachment between them. They've known each other since they were children. Melisande must have mentally contrasted the fun that it was to be around Hugh with what it was like to be around her husband. But the idea that she would have an affair after her marriage is very unlikely. That was not how her father had raised her. That was not the behavior fitting of a queen. Now, things got very complicated. Things got very heated. Because of this accusation, Fulk was able to banish Hugh from the kingdom for 3 years. He wasn't able to do more to him. He didn't want to touch him physically, but he did want him out of the way so that he could not protect Melisande. And so after the court ruled that he would be exiled for 3 years, Hugh bought a ticket to Italy. But before boarding the ship, he came up to Jerusalem to say goodbye to his cousin, to say goodbye officially to Melisande, in the company of many people. And while he was still in Jerusalem, waiting to go back down to the coast, he stopped in at a tavern to have a bite, play some cards. And he sat with his back to the door. Nobody ever does this in a good Western, and he should not have done it either. As he was sitting there, one of Fulk's soldiers was passing by, happened to recognize him, rushed into the tavern and stabbed him in the head. And you can see the sword coming down on Hugh's scalp. And as he stabbed him, the knight cried, "On behalf of King Fulk." Well, he didn't kill Hugh, but Hugh was severely wounded and he still had a boat to catch. So he was bandaged up, carried down to the shore, put on the boat and taken to Italy, where he then died from his wounds. Melisande was furious. It brought out all of her strength. It focused all of the energy that she had been wondering how to use. And nothing that Fulk said could convince her that he had not, in fact, been behind that attack. As she said, the accusation is unproven. There is no justification for having killed a man untried. And in order to backpedal and to regain the ground that he could feel that he was losing in his wife's favor, Fulk quickly handed his overeager knight to the court for justice. Now, the knight pleaded guilty, obviously, what could he do? But he swore that he had acted on his own. He swore that Fulk knew nothing about it, even though he had named him as he struck the young man. It was a spur of the moment crime. He had acted where he saw an opportunity. And he was convicted. And the highest penalty was required. He was dismembered. But the queen was not satisfied. Her righteous anger brought her back her power. Fulk was banished from the royal bedroom. For months, his henchmen feared assassination at the hand of her agents. She was queen, after all, and she had the support of the nobility. And she reclaimed her power and renegotiated her position with her husband. And so as the young Krikor III was consolidating his power slowly, doing his best to win over those who had opposed him in order to create a stable Catholicosate where the talents of all would be welcome and where no one need feel excluded unless he wished. Melisent was reclaiming hers. And in their very different ways, the two of them, Gregory, the descendant of the Illuminator, and Melisent, the half-Crusader, half-Armenian queen, would do everything in their power to ensure the presence of Armenians in positions of power, to benefit Armenian communities within their reach, and to oversee the flourishing of art and culture that we all associate with Cilicia, and that we will talk about in more detail next time.